Welcome to our third virtual reading group extra for The Messiness of Progress. I'm Christy Lynn Horpedahl, the assistant editor at Adam Smith Works, and with me is Dr. Shannon Chamberlain, who is leading the group. If you want more on the texts, check out our first and second extra. In this one, we're talking about Wolf Hall Part 3 and 4, as well as Hume's essay, That Politics May Be Reduced to a Science, and Chapter 30 of Volume 3 of his History of England, in which we get a load of Anne Boleyn fighting amongst the Pope and the Emperor, the Reformation progresses, and the King's final breach with Rome. Hello, Shannon. Thank you for being here. I will jump in with Anne Boleyn. She is now center stage. Mantel portrays her as close to Cromwell in fundamentals. There's a line in the chapter, "Alas, what shall I do for love?" where Cromwell, thinking on Anne, says, "You have to admire her measured exactness, her restraint. She uses her body like a soldier, conserving its resources like one of the masters in the anatomy school at Padua. She divides it up and names every part. This is my thigh, this is my breast, this is my tongue." What do you think? Is Cromwell right? Do we have to admire Anne? And if so, what are we admiring about her?
Well, I think what we were really being asked to admire is how she looks to Cromwell. This isn't the first time that the two of them have been compared. In an earlier part of the book, they're both characterized as working for themselves, and that's something that we kind of admire in Cromwell, in a way, is that he takes kind of a bad situation. He's not somebody who would normally be an advisor to the king. You know, he's somebody who's kept down by his class, his place of birth, all sorts of things about him. And still he manages by talent and ability to rise. And there's something similar going on with Anne Boleyn. Wolsey wants to marry Henry off to a French princess, and then Anne Anne comes along, and that doesn't quite work out. But similarly, she's just a knight's daughter. A couple passages this week where she's just a knight's daughter. So I think in that sense, maybe what causes us to admire her is that we admire Cromwell admiring her. It's interesting too that he compares her to a soldier, because of course he was a soldier as well. And then, of course, there's the culminatory remark on this relationship, that a world where Anne can be queen is a world where Cromwell could be Cromwell. So his own sort of self-actualization is linked to who she is and what she causes the king to do. So there's so many portrayals of Anne Boleyn in fiction. It's almost hard for me to keep them sorted in my head. But Anne, is portrayed here as somebody who I think is deeply flawed, but in a way that that is kind of sympathetic. What does she gain by naming her body parts there? Her sister Mary Boleyn says she's selling herself by the inch. And Mary Boleyn, of course, just sold herself wholesale, which somehow, again, I mean, neither one seem entirely admirable. But if you find yourself in the situation that Anne Boleyn finds herself in, you might as well take advantage of it, I guess. Don't ask, don't get, as Cromwell puts it.
Could be a Boleyn model as well, right? The similarities between them. Well, we could talk about Anne the whole time, but I won't let us. I also want to talk about Hume and Hume's portrayal of King Henry VIII, which is very different from Mantel's. And we discussed in our group that it's not necessarily what you would expect from a man famously known for his robust skepticism. So what do you think it is that Hume sees in Henry when we're reading the histories? What can we learn from Hume about Henry?
Really, the heart of the Henry narrative in Hume for me lies in what Hume says a little bit later, which is that once Henry got a taste of this kind of wealth and power and freedom that the English Reformation gave him, then he starts to take it for granted somehow. He, this is his entitlement now. And what began in an actual, as Hume has it, a real doubt, a sort of crisis of conscience, ends ends in what I think Hume thinks of is just kind of greed, and that feels very Humean to me. That maybe you begin in a belief that comes from a real and genuine place, but our habits change, and I think that's what he's talking about. He's talking about Henry's habits on some level. Henry's habits towards Parliament, Henry's habits towards his kingdom are changed when this little idea is introduced into his head that maybe he's more powerful than he thinks he is. And so that movement does feel very much like Hume to me. It's not clear to me in Wolf Hall whether Cromwell takes the view or Wolsey takes the view that Henry's doubts are genuine or not. It's Wolsey, I think, believes that they are. I think Cromwell thinks that they aren't. Wolsey talks about how the king keeps him up all night discussing matters of his conscience. That really, that's where Wolsey's interest comes into this. Cromwell, maybe because he is more of a cynic, and he's somebody who is more sympathetic to somebody who's dividing up their body in parts, finds it hard to believe that this thought is just occurring to Henry. And I think maybe he's not interested in the question. He's interested in how can I solve this problem in a way that Wolsey wasn't able to solve it, and maybe benefit my own religious preferences in the meantime.
So another thing we see and that we've talked about a lot in the group is history as a balance between what Hume calls the casual humors and characters of particular men. And then especially in the essay we read, talking about the form and administration of a government and how that influences what happens. And so you can kind of see a balance going between these things at different points. When the essay, which is titled, I'm going to forget it, making it into a science, making politics into a science.
Oh yes, that politics might be a science, I think.
Thank you. Yeah, I should have had that in front of me. It seems like in order for politics to be a science, what you need to remove is the arbitrariness. And that arbitrariness is going to be continually introduced by the individuals that are in it. But you also have to think that the Cardinal Wolsey preventing Anne Boleyn's marriage to Henry Percy seems like something that should have had a smaller range of consequences than what we actually see unfolding. So we see huge potential for arbitrariness. But I'm also curious about, do the stories like this, like Mantel's story, even the way that Hume's telling the story, are the characters and the people so interesting that we miss the importance of the administration and the form of government that's lying underneath it? Because the best tool we have to talk about it is sort of through the actions of people we're using as characters. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that the question that essay poses is whether there's anything sort of inevitable about history. And I think that the problem, the way that Hume solves it, I don't think that he thinks that personalities aren't important. He actually seems to think that, another essay we read, that's why we're even interested in history in some sense. But maybe you can't say what an individual decision is going to be, what an individual course of action is going to be, but maybe you can say some things about different forms of government and the amount of arbitrariness that they're going to allow into the world. So the absolute monarch who's unchecked by any other forces is going to be able to introduce a kind of level of arbitrariness that I suspect Hume thinks is just out of control. And you know, that it's interesting to me to read his thoughts on democracy too, because this is, I think, his feeling about democracy is that it introduces a similar amount of possibility for arbitrariness and accident, which is how Plato would have thought about it, how Aristotle would have thought about it. And you know, it seems like what he's trying to get to in suggesting that we make this into a science is how can we cut down on the impact of these arbitrary events to change the course of history. And maybe that's a little bit Cromwell's concern too, in some ways. It seems like, you know, we've talked about this a lot in the group. What does he want? What does he want out of all of this? And he seems to have this idea in his head that by placating Henry's sexual desires, his material desires, he can introduce a kind of level of unarbitrariness into the government. He can stabilize the government somehow by giving Henry what he wants, and make it more friendly to his own. Well, I think that, you know, I'm not sure, you know, I think that possibly the gospel to him is just trade. And that's what Cranmer implies about him as well, that he doesn't really care about the issues that the Reformation brings up on some level. What he cares about is that we have a nation that can trade effectively. And so part of his plan, in some senses, placating the arbitrary wishes of the absolute monarch, in order to gain the power that he'll need to regularize things. But I mean, spoiler alert, it doesn't work.
Shannon, the tables have turned. I am about to defend Cromwell to you instead of the other way around. I do think Cromwell does want people to be free of all kinds of arbitrary power. But like, I think he really is upset about what More is doing to people in the Tower, and in a sense, like that no one should be allowed to do that. So I think he is, at least as Mantel portrays him, I think he is trying to check the arbitrariness of some of the power. And I also really appreciated it in Hume when Hume made the point that after Wolsey died, Henry got worse. And so we should maybe think about that when we're trying to evaluate Wolsey, and how much of what he was doing was in the public spirit versus the private spirit. And at least Hume seems to come down on the side that Wolsey was acting as a good counterbalance to the king. And whatever you want to say about Cromwell didn't do as good a job as Wolsey, because after Wolsey's gone, Henry gets worse.
That's right. Wolsey will burn books and More will burn people. Yeah, and I think that, you know, sort of that comes out really well in the next section, with the martyrdom of Thomas More. I don't think that Cromwell objects to More because More is burning Protestants. I think Cromwell objects to More because he's burning anyone, or he's torturing people or racking them. And so I think in that sense he is a bit principled. But you know, I'm wondering if really what he thinks that he's doing with Henry. I think that he believes there's something non-arbitrary about trade, that trade somehow reflects the world as it is. It's you know, maybe similar to a way that a modern economist would think about it. It's reflects our desires. It reflects the, you know, a sort of spontaneous order that is fairer than the order in which he lives at the moment. And he seems to think that he can bring this about by getting close enough to Henry. But the sort of moral compromise is that to get close to Henry means just placating the arbitrary whims of the monarch, and maybe introducing a bit more chaos and arbitrariness into the system in service of purging the system of arbitrariness and chaos.
one of my favorite opening questions so far of this virtual reading group was the one that you asked last time, where you're asking about where does power exist and how is it shared? And you said this quote, I think, is one of your favorite quotes from the book. I think you said that. So I'm hoping you would read that quote and then tell us what you like about it.
So the context of this quotation is that he's been told to fix Harry Percy, the Earl of Northumberland, who has decided quite a few years after the fact that he and Anne Boleyn actually exchanged vows that were in this period in England considered just as binding as a legal marriage. And obviously this is gonna put a crimp in everyone's plans and everyone's plot. And so the Boleyn family tells Cromwell to go fix him like the cardinal fixed him. And he finds him drinking at a tavern, drunk at a tavern, more accurately, disheveled, a mess. And he has to persuade him that holding to his claim here is not going to be in his best interests. And so he threatens to ruin him financially. And Percy says, what does that matter? I'm an earl. You can't take me down with your banker friends. What? This is not something that's going to happen. And this quotation is actually happening inside Cromwell's head. He's trying to figure out how to explain to this guy that the world has changed, and that his understanding of who he is now built on sand. And so this is Cromwell's interior monologue. How can he explain it to him? The world is not run from where he thinks, not from his border fortresses, not even from Whitehall. The world is run from Antwerp, from Florence, from places he has never imagined, from Lisbon, from where the ships with sails of silk drift west and are burned up in the sun, not from castle walls, but from counting houses, not by the call of the bugle, but by the click of the abacus, not by the grate and click of the mechanism of the gun, but by the scrape of the pen on the page of the promissory note that pays for the gun and the gunsmith and the powder and the shot. And I think it's just a beautiful piece of writing, first of all, that cadence at the end, not the call of the bugle, the click of the abacus, the parallel structure there. But sort of thematically, it is explaining that things are not always as they seem. That it may look like Henry has power. I mean, that's the reference to Whitehall. That's actually one of Wolsey's palaces that Henry took over. It's I think as close as we get in the book to a statement of what matters to Cromwell and what his view of the world is. He's sort of famously tricky. People are always asking him, what do you think? What do you think? And he never wants to tell them. He's always arranging his face. But when we get this little tiny bit of interior monologue, we think finally establish how he sees the world, and what actually matters to him. And it's an account that's flattering to him, of course, because he's the person who scrapes the pen on the promissory note. But he's also not entirely wrong. And he's, again, sort of articulating something that's changed within his own lifetime. He started off as a boy, as we learned in the beginning of the novel, going off to war. And he says that very quickly he got into trading money. And he also has trouble explaining that to someone else in the novel. But this is his journey. This is where, how he understands the trajectory of his life.
Well, I love that too, and I'm glad you pointed our attention to it. And I'm excited to read the rest of the book. I have to confess that the first time I tried to read it, I stopped during the sections that we covered this last time at the woman who's getting burned. I got to that section and I put it down and said I could read the rest later. So I am excited to get to read the conclusion, even though I know some of it already. but we'll be back for one more extra after our last session. And thank you, Shannon, for doing this VRG with me today.
Thanks, Christy.